husband's tools were still in the garage when I started driving for the food bank. That's how grief works sometimes. You donate the clothes, you cancel the subscriptions, you forward the mail, but the garage stays exactly as he left it because opening that door means admitting he's never coming back to finish the birdhouse he started in October. Gerald died on a Tuesday in March, 17 months after his diagnosis, and I spent the next 4 months learning what it means to be a woman of 64 who has never once in 41 years of marriage paid a bill, balanced a checkbook, or sat alone at a table set for one. The money was fine. Not comfortable, but fine. Gerald had been careful that way, methodical in the way that engineers are methodical about everything, including dying. He'd left me the house, a modest savings account, and a pension from 30 years at the county water authority. What he hadn't left me was a reason to get out of bed before 10 o'clock. My daughter drove up from Atlanta in June and sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and said, "Mom, you need something to do, not a hobby, something real. Something that gets you out of this house 3 times a week and puts you around other human beings before you turn completely feral." She wasn't wrong. I'd started talking to Gerald's tools to the closed garage door. Just small things. Asking the circular saw if it remembered the deck he built in 1998. Thanking the level for its service. That's how I ended up at the Millbrook Community Food Bank every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, sorting donations and loading boxes into people's cars in the parking lot on Chestnut Street. It wasn't glamorous. Most days smelled like overripe bananas and someone's idea of charity being a can of water chestnuts from 2019. But it got me out of bed, got me dressed in real clothes, got me talking to people whose problems were larger than my own grief, which turns out to be the most effective antidepressant ever discovered. That's also how I met Darius. The food bank closed at 6 on my shift days, and the bus back to my neighborhood on Sycamore Ridge ran at 6:15 from the stop on the corner of Chestnut and Main. For the first 2 weeks, I made that bus every time. Then, in September, the city rerouted the line. Construction on the overpass, they said. The new schedule had the last bus leaving at 5:40, a full 20 minutes before my shift ended. I wasn't about to leave early. Those last 20 minutes were when the families with working parents showed up, rushing from jobs to collect their boxes before we locked the doors. I wasn't going to be the person who turned a lock in someone's face because I needed to catch a bus. So I called my daughter, who suggested a rideshare app, which she installed on my phone during one of our Sunday video calls while walking me through it with the patience of a woman who has explained technology to her mother many times before and expects to explain it many more times before one of them dies. The first night I used it, a blue Chevrolet Malibu pulled up to the food bank's side entrance at 6:12. The driver was a large man, somewhere in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he clearly forgot were there. His name on the app said Darius. He looked at me in the rearview mirror when I climbed in. "You work at the food bank?" he asked. "Just volunteer," I said, 3 days a week. He nodded like that meant something. "Good work," he said. "Simple as that. No performance of admiration, no inflated praise. Just good work. The way you'd acknowledge someone who'd done exactly what they were supposed to do." I liked him immediately. I told him my address on Sycamore Ridge, and we drove through the early dark of Millbrook in comfortable quiet for a few minutes before I asked him how long he'd been driving. 6 years, he said. Did 22 years in law enforcement before that? Sheriff's Department over in Carteret County. I looked up at that. You left. He was quiet for a moment. It left me, he said finally, then changed the subject to whether I'd noticed the new Italian place on Denison Avenue and whether I thought it would last the winter. I didn't push. You learn, when you've spent enough years listening to people, when a subject is closed. He dropped me at my house at 6:28, wished me a good night with the same quiet courtesy he'd used the whole ride, and drove away before I'd even gotten my key in the lock. The next Monday, when I opened the app, Darius accepted my request within 40 seconds. That happened again Wednesday, and the following Monday. By the third week, I understood that he was positioning himself near Chestnut Street around 6 o'clock, making sure he'd be the one to pick me up. I didn't say anything about it. Some courtesies are best accepted without examination. We talked more as the weeks went on. I learned that Darius had a son named Marcus who played college baseball in Tennessee and called every Sunday. I learned that Darius lived alone in a rental house on the east side of Millbrook since his wife Renata had passed 3 years ago from a fast and merciless cancer that gave them 11 weeks between diagnosis and goodbye. I learned that he volunteered Saturdays at a youth mentorship program downtown, that he'd read every James Lee Burke novel ever published, and that he took his coffee black with 2 sugars, which he described as the correct way, and anyone who said differently was entitled to their wrong opinion. I started bringing him coffee. It wasn't planned. The food bank had a little kitchenette in the back where volunteers made themselves drinks throughout the shift, and one Wednesday in October, I just made 2 cups instead of 1 and carried them both outside when his Malibu pulled up. When I handed his through the window, he looked at it the way people look at things they weren't expecting and suddenly realized they needed. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," I said, "but you drive me home 3 times a week in the dark, and you've never once made me feel like a burden. Seems like the least I can do is make sure you've got something hot to drink." He took a sip and said nothing for a moment. "Then Renata used to say that the people who say they don't want a fuss are usually the ones who need a fuss the most." I thought about Gerald and his tools in the garage. "I think Renata was right," I said. After that, the coffee was ours, part of the arrangement, the way some things just become part of arrangements between people who see each other regularly and have decided, without stating it outright, that they like each other. Sometimes I brought cookies from the batch I made Sunday nights to keep my hands busy. Once, when the food bank got a donation of fancy hot chocolate packets from some corporate drive, I brought him one of those and he laughed at the little marshmallows in a way that made him seem 20 years younger. I told him about Gerald, about the garage, about learning to sleep in the middle of a bed instead of on my side after 4 decades of sleeping on my side. He listened the way people listen when they actually intend to remember what you've said. "You're doing better than you think," he told me one November evening. I said I wasn't sure about that. "You got out of bed," he said. "You showed up. That's the whole job, Martha. Everything else is detail. My name is Martha, by the way." Martha Elaine Good, which was my maiden name and the name I kept alongside Gerald's because I'd published 2 papers under it in a former life when I taught high school history and briefly imagined I might become an academic. That former life felt very far away in Millbrook, driving home through the November dark with Darius, talking about nothing and everything the way people do when they found an unexpected frequency that matches. The Wednesday that changed things was the first week of December. Darius picked me up at the usual time, but something was different from the first moment I got in the car. His shoulders were set differently. His hands on the wheel had a stillness that wasn't relaxed but controlled, the stillness of someone keeping something contained. We drove 3 blocks in silence. Then he said, "Martha, I need to tell you something and I need you to not react until I've finished." My stomach dropped. "What's wrong? Do you know a man named Philip Crow? Goes by Phil? You'd know him from the food bank." I thought for a moment. "Tall man? Gray beard? Always wears a green vest?" "That's him." "How well do you know him?" "Barely," I said. "He volunteers on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm there. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. We overlap sometimes when schedules shift. He's been there longer than me, knows where everything is." "Why?" Darius took a long breath. "I picked him up 3 weeks ago, Tuesday night, late from Hannigan's bar on Rutledge Street. He'd been drinking, seriously drinking. He got in my car and got on the phone almost immediately, and at first I gave him privacy the way you do, kept my eyes on the road and the volume in my head turned up, but then..." He paused. "Then I heard him say your name. The heat in the car suddenly felt insufficient. He said, and these are close to his exact words, 'Martha Good has been pulling records every shift. She's going to find it. We need to move everything before Friday or it's over.'" "I don't understand," I said, though some cold and animal part of my brain was already beginning to. Darius glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Could have been nothing. Could have been drunk rambling about somebody else. But I paid attention after that, the way I used to pay attention when I was working. "And Martha, I've picked him up 4 more times in the last 3 weeks. Same bar, always late, always on the phone with the same person. And you come up in those calls more than once. What does he say? Last week, he said, she volunteers 3 days, leaves by 6:15. House is on Sycamore Ridge. I've driven past it. He said he needed to know if you'd taken anything home. The words landed like something physical. He's been watching my house? Darius's voice was level, but his knuckles were pale on the steering wheel. I drove past your street tonight on my way to pick you up. There was a black Subaru parked at the top of your driveway. Not in the driveway, at the top of it, partially blocking it. Engine off, lights off. That's not my car, I whispered. I don't have a Subaru. I know. He didn't turn onto my street. He drove past it and kept going. I sat very still. Darius, where are we going right now? I realized then that we weren't on the route to my house. We were heading toward the center of town, toward the lights. Somewhere safe, he said. And then you're going to tell me everything you know about Phil Crow. And I'm going to tell you everything I've heard, and then we're going to the police. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I want to tell you I argued. I want to tell you I kept a cool head and asked logical questions. What I actually did was sit in the back seat of Darius's Chevrolet and shake, slightly and silently, for about 90 seconds. While the streetlights of Millbrook moved past the windows and my brain attempted to process the idea that a man I'd handed donated canned goods to for 3 months had been watching my house. He pulled into the parking lot of a diner on Fulton Street, kept the engine running for heat, and turned around to face me properly. What records? He asked. What would Phil Crow be afraid of you finding? And that's when it started to make sense. Not all at once. In pieces, the way things make sense when you've been sitting in front of them for weeks without the right frame. The food bank had a client management system. Not sophisticated, just a database where we logged what families received each visit, tracked their eligibility, updated contact information. Standard nonprofit record keeping. About 6 weeks earlier, my supervisor, a young woman named Cassidy, who ran the food bank with the focused energy of someone half her age, had mentioned in passing that she'd noticed some irregularities in the distribution records. Boxes logged as delivered to client accounts that, when she cross-referenced, seemed to have been flagged as inactive. Families who'd moved away or whose situations had changed, still showing pickups. I'd helped her pull some of the physical logs to check against the digital records. Just 2 afternoons of cross-referencing, nothing I thought of as significant. I mentioned to Phil, when he asked what Cassidy and I were working on, that we were doing a records audit. He'd nodded and said, good for you. Keep the books clean. I told all of this to Darius in the parking lot of the diner on Fulton Street. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, does the food bank receive grant funding? County grant, I said, and 2 private foundations, plus corporate donations. And if someone were logging ghost pickups, fake distributions to inactive client accounts, they could be redirecting the physical inventory, I said slowly, the boxes, the donated goods, logging them as distributed when they were actually being taken somewhere else, and then reporting inflated distribution numbers to the grant funders to justify continued funding. That's fraud, Darius said, against the county, against the foundations. Phil Crow has been there 7 years, I said. Cassidy told me that in my first week. 7 years. Long enough to understand exactly how the records work and where the gaps are, and long enough to know that an audit would find him. I felt nauseated. These were donations for families who needed them. For the people who showed up in the parking lot on Chestnut Street at 5:55 with kids in the back seat. And someone had been siphoning from that for years, and now that someone knew I'd been helping pull records, and he'd been watching my house to find out what I might have taken home. We need to go, Darius said. Right now. You're not going home tonight, Martha. I want to. I know. But that car at your driveway wasn't there by accident. He doesn't know we know. Which means right now we have an advantage, and we need to use it before that changes. He was right. I recognized the rightness of it, even through the nausea. 22 years in law enforcement teaches a person how to think in these moments, and I had exactly 0 years in law enforcement and was currently learning that this matters. Where? I asked. Police station on Addison Street. I still know people there. And Martha, I kept notes. Notes? He held up his phone briefly. Every pickup. Dates, times, fragments of what I heard. Former habit. You do it for enough years and it becomes automatic, logging the things that don't sit right, keeping a record because you don't know yet what will matter later. He'd been doing it since the first time he heard my name in Phil Crow's drunk phone call. 3 weeks of dates and times and carefully recorded phrases. We drove to the police station. Darius walked in like someone who knew the geography, who'd walked into police stations in a professional capacity for 2 decades and still carried that in his posture. An officer at the front desk recognized him, and the recognition was warm, the kind between people who'd worked alongside each other. We were in an interview room within 15 minutes. A detective named Okafor came in, listened to Darius's account, looked at the notes on his phone, looked at me, and asked me to walk him through the records audit from the beginning. I did. Every detail I could remember. The inactive accounts, the flag distributions. The afternoon Cassidy and I had spent cross-referencing physical logs against the database. Detective Okafor asked, "Did you take anything home? Any physical records, printed reports, anything from the food bank?" "No," I said. "Everything stayed on site. I don't even have login access from outside the building. So whatever Crow thought you might have at your home doesn't actually exist." "That's right." The detective's expression shifted slightly, which means the only thing he knows for certain is that you've been part of an audit that might expose him, and his response to that has been to surveil your home. When he said it that way out loud in a police interview room, it became fully real in a way it hadn't quite been until that moment. A man I'd worked alongside, who'd shown me where the backup supply of paper bags was kept and which donation boxes were too damp to use, had been parked outside my house in the dark, watching for my lights. "Be right back," Detective Okafor said, and left the room. Darius sat beside me at the table. He didn't say anything comforting, and I didn't need him to. He just sat there, steady and present, the way he was every evening in the front seat of his Malibu, and that steadiness was its own kind of comfort. Detective Okafor came back 20 minutes later. He confirmed the black Subaru was registered to Philip Allen Crow. He also confirmed, after a call to the county grants office, that the Millbrook Community Food Bank was currently receiving $47,000 annually in county funding based on distribution numbers that, if falsified, constituted grant fraud. They moved quickly after that. A second detective was on the phone within the hour. I was escorted to a hotel 3 blocks from the station with a patrol car parked outside for the night. Darius stayed to give his full statement. His phone notes officially entered into the record. I sat in a hotel room with the curtains drawn and the television on for noise and called my daughter at 11 o'clock at night. She said she was getting in her car. I told her she absolutely did not need to do that I was fine, that there was a police car outside. She said she was already putting on her shoes. She arrived at 2 in the morning. We sat on the hotel bed and I told her the whole story. When I got to the part about Darius, about the 3 weeks of careful notes, about him driving past my street and seeing the car and coming to get me anyway, she pressed her hand over her mouth and didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, that man paid attention to you when nobody else was." "I know," I said. "I mean really paid attention, the kind that protects people." "I know." They arrested Philip Crow at 6:45 the following morning at his apartment on the other side of Millbrook. The search of his vehicle and storage unit turned up documentation of a scheme he'd been running for 4 years, rerouting donated goods to an account he'd set up under a fictitious nonprofit and then converting the goods to cash through a network of informal resale. The total value redirected from the Millbrook Community Food Bank, according to the county prosecutor's office, was over $180,000. Families. Those were families' boxes. 4 years of families who'd needed those groceries. He was charged with grant fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts related to the stalking statutes for what he'd done outside my house. My supervisor, Cassidy, when she found out, sat down in her office and cried for 20 minutes and then got up and started overhauling every data access protocol the food bank had because she was exactly that kind of person. I went back to volunteering the following Monday. Darius picked me up that evening and I sat in the front seat for the first time. He didn't comment on it. He just adjusted the mirror slightly and asked how I was holding up. "Better," I said. "Getting there." "You did a brave thing," he said. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd been protected by someone paying better attention than I was. He shook his head at that. You weren't passive, Martha. You noticed the irregularities. You helped Cassidy pull those records. You got in the car and told me everything clearly enough that I knew what I was dealing with. That's not nothing. I looked out the window at Millbrook going by. Why did you pay attention? I asked. From the beginning. You could have just driven. Let it be someone else's problem. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. When I was a deputy, he said finally, I responded to a call out on Miller Farm Road. Domestic situation. The neighbors had called it in. My partner and I went out there, talked to both parties, looked around, and determined there was no imminent danger. Filed our report, went back to our shift. He stopped. 2 days later, he said, I got called back to Miller Farm Road. The woman was in the hospital. She'd had to call a friend to take her because she was afraid to call us again. Fractured orbital socket, 3 cracked ribs. Oh, Darius, I missed it, he said. Not because I was bad at my job, because I was in a hurry and I told myself it looked okay and I moved on, and she paid for that. I've spent a long time making sure I don't move on too fast from things that don't quite look right. I thought about that for the rest of the drive, about the cost of inattention, about the 22 years that came after Miller Farm Road, a man carrying a debt he decided to pay in daily installments by noticing things, by not moving on too fast. You saved my life, I said as he pulled up to my house on Sycamore Ridge. He shook his head. I did my job, the one I should have always been doing. No, I said, you did more than that. I bring you coffee 3 times a week, Darius. Most people aren't going to carry 3 weeks of notes because they overheard something about the woman who brings them coffee. That's not job. That's something else. He looked at the steering wheel for a moment. Renata would have done exactly what you did, he said quietly. Brought coffee. Asked about people's days. Made sure nobody felt like they were just passing through. She was like that. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it. And when you started, I thought, this is somebody worth paying attention to. So I did. I got out of the car and stood on my front porch and watched his taillights go down Sycamore Ridge until they disappeared. The trial took 9 months. Darius and I both testified. His notes and his recorded account of Crow's phone calls in the backseat of the Malibu became central to the prosecution's evidence of premeditation. The defense tried to argue that an overheard drunk conversation was unreliable testimony, and Detective Okafor got to explain to the jury that overheard conversations had been admissible for somewhat longer than the defense attorney had been alive. Philip Crow was convicted on all counts. 14 years. I was back at the food bank the Monday after the verdict. So was Darius, as it turned out. He'd started volunteering there on Mondays about 2 months into the trial, which is a thing he mentioned very casually one evening, as if it were an obvious and unremarkable decision. My daughter, who had started calling 3 times a week instead of once, said, Mom, he's not going to say he likes you. You're going to have to do something about that yourself. I said I didn't know what she was talking about. She said, Mom, that was a whole conversation. Cassidy hired a grants compliance consultant and rebuilt the food bank's record system from scratch over the following year. The county audit, prompted by the prosecution, resulted in a full review of grant disbursements across 14 nonprofits and recovered over $400,000 in misdirected public funds, small tributaries from one river. Darius's son Marcus came to visit that spring, a tall young man with his father's steady eyes and a handshake like a declaration of intent. He shook my hand at the food bank and said, You're the coffee lady. Dad talks about you. I said I hoped that was good. He grinned. He said you're the most stubborn person he's ever met, which from him is definitely a compliment. I'm 65 now. Gerald's tools are still in the garage, but I've started using some of them. Not the power saw, I'm not there yet, but the hammer and the level and the smaller things. Last month, I fixed the railing on the back steps by myself and stood there afterward feeling, for the first time in a long time, like a person capable of managing her own life. I still bring Darius coffee on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays. He still says I didn't have to. I still say I know. What I think about more than anything, when I think about that December and everything that came after, is the smallness of the original act. A cup of coffee handed through a car window. the asking of a person's name, the choosing to see someone as a human being with a history and a weight to carry rather than simply a function, a driver, a means to an end. That small choice compounded into something that saved my life. And somewhere underneath that, in the deepest layer of what happened, a woman on Miller Farm Road in a story I will never know, fully compounded forward into Darius, who compounded forward into me, who hopefully compounds forward into something I can't see yet. That's how it works, I think. You can't always know what you're setting in motion. You can only decide what kind of motion to set. There is a new volunteer at the food bank. Older man, recently retired, clearly lost in the way that people are lost when a structure that contained their whole identity has been removed. He sorts donations slowly because he's learning the system, and nobody has told him it gets faster, and he eats his lunch alone at the end of the table by the window. Last Wednesday, I brought him a coffee and sat down. "I'm Martha," I said. He looked up. "Robert," he said. He seemed surprised in the way that people are surprised when they expected to be invisible. I know what that surprise feels like. I know what it costs someone to offer it and what it means to the person receiving it. So be kind, not as a strategy, not because it's likely to come back around, though sometimes it does. Sometimes it comes back around in ways you couldn't have imagined and saves you in the dark. Be kind because the person in front of you is carrying something. Because we are all at various hours, the woman learning to sleep in the middle of a bed, the driver logging notes about the things that don't sit right, the new volunteer eating alone by the window. Be kind because it is the most serious thing we can do with our ordinary days.